This 1910 family portrait contains an enigmatic symbol. What does it mean? The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Riverside Historical Society in Portland, Oregon, as Margaret Chen carefully cataloged the latest donation of family photographs. At 62, she had spent the better part of 2 decades preserving local history, but today felt different. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted a sepia-toned portrait from the cardboard box, not from age, but from an inexplicable sense of anticipation. The photograph showed a well-dressed family of 5 standing before their Victorian home. The father, distinguished in his 3-piece suit, stood behind his seated wife, who wore an elaborate dark dress with intricate lace. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, were arranged around them, their faces serious as was customary for portraits of that era. The brass nameplate at the bottom read, "The Whitmore Family, 1910. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and brought the photograph closer to the lamp. The image was remarkably clear for its age, each detail crisp and defined. She could make out the ornate woodwork of the house's porch, the careful arrangement of the mother's hair, even the texture of the children's clothing. But as her eyes wandered across the composition, something caught her attention, something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, barely visible on the collar of the youngest child's shirt, was a symbol she had never seen before. It appeared to be embroidered or perhaps pinned, a small, intricate design that seemed almost deliberate in its placement. The symbol consisted of interlocking circles with what looked like botanical elements woven throughout. But there was something else, something that defied easy categorization. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass, her pulse quickening. The symbol became clearer under magnification, revealing layers of detail that seemed impossible for something so small. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, almost impossibly precise for its time and size. But what troubled her most was the nagging feeling that this symbol meant something significant, something that had been deliberately preserved in this family portrait. She glanced at the donation form. The photographs had been left by Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman whose grandmother had been a seamstress in Portland's early days. The note simply stated that these were family pictures that might be of interest to historians. No mention of the Whitmore family, no explanation of the connection. Margaret set the photograph carefully on her desk and reached for her phone. After 30 years of historical research, she had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct told her that this seemingly innocent family portrait held secrets that had been waiting over a century to be discovered. The next morning brought crisp October air and renewed determination. Margaret arrived at the Historical Society early, the Whitmore portrait already consuming her thoughts. She had spent half the night researching the family name in Portland's historical records, but the Whitmores seemed to have vanished from official documentation after 1912, an oddity that only deepened the mystery. Dr. James Rodriguez, the Society's photography expert, arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. A soft-spoken man in his 50s with an expertise in early 20th century photographic techniques. He was Margaret's first call when historical images posed puzzles. His weathered hands handled the portrait with reverence as he examined it under professional lighting equipment. "This is exceptional quality for 1910, he murmured, adjusting his equipment. The clarity, the composition, whoever took this knew what they were doing. "But what's this you wanted me to look at?" Margaret pointed to the symbol on the child's collar. Under Dr. Rodriguez's high-powered magnification system, the symbol revealed even more intricate details. "My God," he whispered, leaning back from the eyepiece. "Margaret, this isn't embroidery or a pin. This appears to be somehow integrated into the photograph itself during the developing process. The symbol has a different grain structure than the surrounding fabric. It's as if it was added deliberately to the image, but with a technique I've never seen before." Margaret's heart raced. Added during development? But why would someone do that? And how? Dr. Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "I've studied thousands of photographs from this era. The technology to manipulate images with this level of precision simply didn't exist in 1910. At least, not in any studio I know of." They spent the next hour examining every inch of the photograph. The rest of the image appeared completely authentic. The lighting, shadows, and grain all consistent with 1910 photography. Only the symbols seemed to exist outside the normal parameters of early photographic science. "There's something else," Dr. Rodriguez said, pointing to the background of the image. "Look at the house itself. The architectural details, the window configurations. This style is consistent with Portland's Alphabet District, specifically the area that was developed between 1905 and 1910. Margaret made a note to visit the neighborhood. If the house still existed, it might provide clues about the family. As Dr. Rodriguez packed his equipment, he turned to Margaret with a troubled expression. In 40 years of examining historical photographs, I've learned that when something seems impossible, it usually means we're missing crucial information. That symbol wasn't placed there by accident, and the technique used to integrate it suggests knowledge far beyond what was commonly available. Someone wanted that symbol to be part of this family's legacy, and they went to extraordinary lengths to ensure it would be preserved. Margaret nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. The afternoon would bring a visit to the Alphabet District, but first she needed to understand more about the Hartwell family and their connection to this mysterious portrait. Eleanor Hartwell lived in a modest craftsman bungalow in southeast Portland, surrounded by gardens that spoke of decades of careful tending. At 87, her movements were deliberate but sure as she welcomed Margaret into her living room, where afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains that had seen better decades. "I wondered if someone would come asking about those photographs," Eleanor said, settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. Her voice carried the slight tremor of age but retained the clarity of a sharp mind. "My grandmother always said they held secrets, but she never told me what kind." Margaret pulled out the Whitmore portrait, watching Eleanor's face carefully. The elderly woman's expression shifted immediately upon seeing the image, a mixture of recognition and something deeper, perhaps fear. Grandmother Rose spoke of this family often, especially toward the end of her life. She was their seamstress, you see, back when such things were more common. The Whitmores were particular about their clothing, very specific about details that seemed odd to her. "What kind of details?" Margaret asked, leaning forward. Eleanor's fingers traced patterns in the air as she remembered. Grandmother said Mrs. Whitmore would bring her fabric samples and ask for very specific stitching patterns. Not decorative work, mind you, but precise geometric designs that had to be sewn into seams where they wouldn't normally be seen. She said the woman was insistent that these patterns be exact, down to the smallest detail. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Did your grandmother keep any examples of these patterns?" Eleanor nodded slowly and made her way to an old secretary desk in the corner. From a small drawer, she withdrew a leather-bound notebook filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting and detailed sketches. "Rose kept meticulous records of all her work," Eleanor explained, returning to her chair. "She said good seamstresses needed to remember every detail for their clients." Margaret opened the notebook carefully, its pages yellow with age. The entries were organized by date and client name, each accompanied by small sketches and notes about fabric types, measurements, and special requirements. She found the Whitmore entries dated between 1908 and 1912. Rose's notes were extensive. Measurements for the entire family, fabric preferences, and most intriguingly, a series of detailed sketches showing geometric patterns that were to be incorporated into various garments. The patterns were complex, involving interlocking shapes and botanical elements that looked remarkably similar to the symbol in the photograph. "Eleanor," Margaret said carefully, "did your grandmother ever mention why the Whitmores wanted these specific patterns?" The elderly woman's expression grew thoughtful. She said Mrs. Whitmore told her they were family traditions, symbols that had been passed down through generations. But grandmother always suspected there was more to it. She said the family seemed different, educated in ways that were unusual for the time, especially the children. Margaret made careful notes as Eleanor continued. "The youngest child, the boy in the photograph, was particularly bright according to grandmother. She said he could read Latin and spoke of scientific concepts that seemed far beyond his years. Mrs. Whitmore homeschooled all the children, which was uncommon then." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to understand that the Whitmore family had been deliberately mysterious, even to those who worked closely with them. The symbol in the photograph was beginning to seem less like a simple family tradition and more like a carefully preserved message. The address from Rose's notebook led Margaret to a tree-lined street in Portland's Alphabet District, where Victorian houses stood like sentinels from another era. Number 847 Northwest Everett Street still existed, though it had been converted into apartments sometime in the 1950s. The distinctive architectural details from the photograph remained intact: the elaborate gingerbread trim, the wraparound porch, even the specific window configurations that Dr. Rodriguez had noted. Margaret stood on the sidewalk, comparing the house to the photograph. The match was perfect, confirming that this had indeed been the Whitmore family home. The current owner, a friendly man in his 40s named David Park, had agreed to let her examine the property after she explained her research. "The house has quite a history," David said as he led her up the front steps. "I've been restoring it for 5 years now, and I keep finding unusual things. Previous owners left behind some interesting artifacts." Inside, the house retained much of its original character. The hardwood floors creaked with age, and the detailed woodwork spoke of craftsmanship from Portland's early boom years. David led her to what had been the family's main parlor. "This is where I found the most interesting thing," he said, kneeling beside a section of wainscoting that appeared slightly different from the rest. "I was doing electrical work and had to remove some of the original paneling. Behind it I found this." He carefully pried away a loose piece of wood, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Inside was a metal box, no larger than a cigar case, tarnished with age but still sealed. Margaret's hands trembled as she examined the box. It bore the same intricate symbol that appeared in the photograph, etched into the metal with extraordinary precision. "Have you opened it?" she asked. David shook his head. "I wasn't sure I should. It seemed too important to disturb without knowing more about its history." With David's permission, Margaret carefully worked to open the box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were several items: a small leather journal, a collection of photographs, and what appeared to be technical drawings on high-quality paper. The journal was written in a careful hand and dated 1910-1912. The first entry was signed by Thomas Whitmore and began, "The work we do here must be preserved for future generations, who will understand its significance." The symbol serves as both identification and protection, a mark that will guide those who know how to look. Margaret felt her breath catch. This wasn't just a family secret. It was the beginning of understanding something far more significant. The photographs in the box showed the Whitmore family at work in what appeared to be a sophisticated laboratory, complete with equipment that seemed advanced even by modern standards. As she examined the technical drawings, Margaret realized she was holding documentation of scientific work that had been conducted in secret, right here in this Portland home. The symbol in the family portrait wasn't just a family tradition. It was a marker, a way to identify and preserve evidence of work that had been deliberately hidden from the world. The afternoon light was fading as Margaret carefully repacked the box's contents. Whatever the Whitmore family had been doing in 1910, they had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it would be remembered by the right people at the right time. Margaret spent the evening in her home office, carefully examining the contents of the metal box by the light of her desk lamp. Thomas Whitmore's journal revealed a story that challenged everything she thought she knew about early 20th century Portland. The family hadn't been simply well-educated. They had been conducting advanced scientific research decades ahead of their time. The journal entries described experiments in what Thomas called photographic preservation of complex information. The technical drawings showed apparatus for manipulating photographic emulsions in ways that wouldn't be widely known until the 1940s. Most remarkable were the detailed notes about embedding symbolic information into photographs through precise chemical manipulation during the development process. "The symbol must carry forward our work," one entry read. "Future researchers with proper knowledge will recognize the marker and understand that this image contains more than what appears on the surface. We have developed a method to preserve complex data within the grain structure itself, invisible to casual observation, but recoverable with appropriate techniques." Margaret paused, her coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. The symbol in the family portrait wasn't just decorative, it was a key, indicating that the photograph itself contained hidden information. But what information, and how could it be recovered? The next morning, she called Dr. Rodriguez with her discoveries. His response was immediate and urgent. "Margaret, if what you're describing is accurate, we're looking at photographic techniques that were revolutionary for their time. But more than that, if there's truly embedded information in that photograph, we need specialized equipment to recover it safely." They arranged to meet at Portland State University, where Dr. Rodriguez had connections with the imaging science department. Dr. Sarah Kim, a professor specializing in historical photograph restoration, agreed to examine the portrait using the university's advanced digital analysis equipment. In Dr. Kim's laboratory, the Whitmore portrait was subjected to spectral analysis, revealing layers of information that had been invisible for over a century. Under specific light wavelengths, patterns emerged within the photograph's grain structure, geometric designs, and what appeared to be alphanumeric sequences embedded throughout the image. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Kim murmured, adjusting the analysis parameters. The level of sophistication required to embed this information without affecting the visible image is remarkable. Whoever did this had knowledge of photographic chemistry that wouldn't be formally documented for decades. As the analysis continued, a clearer picture emerged. The embedded information appeared to be coordinates, chemical formulas, and what looked like architectural plans. Thomas Whitmore had essentially created a photographic vault, storing critical information in plain sight, while making it appear to be nothing more than a family portrait. "There's something else," Dr. Kim said, pointing to a section of the analysis. "These coordinates, they're local, specific locations within Portland. If this information is accurate, it's pointing to other sites where the Whitmore family may have hidden additional materials." Margaret felt the familiar thrill of discovery, but also a growing sense of responsibility. The Whitmore family had trusted that someday someone would understand their symbol and recover their work. After more than a century, that responsibility had fallen to her. The afternoon was spent mapping the coordinates and planning visits to the indicated locations. Whatever the Whitmore family had been working on, it was significant enough to require multiple hiding places and an elaborate system of preservation that spanned over 100 years. The first set of coordinates led Margaret and Dr. Rodriguez to Laurelhurst Park, specifically to an area near the pond where a small memorial garden had been established in the 1920s. The location seemed unremarkable at first, a quiet spot surrounded by mature oak trees where families often brought children to feed ducks. But the coordinates were precise, pointing to a specific tree whose base showed signs of unusual concrete work that didn't match the surrounding landscape. Margaret's research had revealed that the park's development had included several donor memorial sites, where wealthy Portland families had contributed to the park's infrastructure in exchange for small commemorative installations. According to the park's historical records, Margaret explained to Dr. Rodriguez as they examined the concrete base, this memorial was sponsored by the Whitmore Scientific Foundation in 1923, but there's no record of what happened to the foundation after that date. Dr. Rodriguez ran his hands over the concrete, finding what felt like a deliberately created depression. "Here," he said, "this feels like it might open somehow." They worked carefully, using archaeological techniques to avoid damaging whatever might be concealed. The depression revealed itself to be a carefully crafted compartment, sealed with a metal cover that bore the familiar symbol. Inside the compartment was another metal container, smaller but similar to the one found in the house. This box contained more photographs and what appeared to be the continuation of Thomas Whitmore's journal, covering the years 1913 to 1925. The later entries revealed that the family's work had continued long after the 1910 portrait and had involved other families and researchers throughout the Pacific Northwest. "We were not alone in this endeavor," one entry read. "Colleagues in Seattle, San Francisco, and Vancouver have established similar preservation sites. The network grows stronger as our understanding deepens. The symbol connects us all, ensuring that future discoveries will be shared among those who can properly interpret our work." Margaret realized they weren't just investigating one family's secret. They were uncovering evidence of an entire network of early 20th century researchers who had been decades ahead of their time. The second set of coordinates pointed to a location in southeast Portland, near what had once been an industrial area, but was now converted to artists' studios and small businesses. The building that stood at the specified coordinates was a brick warehouse from the 1910s that had been converted into studio spaces. The current owner, an artist named Lisa Chen, was intrigued by their research and eager to help. "I've always wondered about some of the unusual features in this building," she said, leading them to the basement level. In the basement, they found evidence of sophisticated renovation that had been done in the early 1900s. Hidden behind what appeared to be a later addition was another sealed compartment, this one containing equipment that Margaret recognized from Thomas Whitmore's technical drawings. The apparatus was complex, involving precisely ground lenses and chemical processing equipment that represented the cutting edge of photographic science. But most remarkable was a collection of glass plates, photographic negatives that had been stored with the same careful preservation techniques used for the other materials. When Dr. Rodriguez examined them with proper lighting, the plates revealed images of other families, all featuring the same symbolic marker that had appeared in the Whitmore portrait. As the day ended, Margaret realized that what had started as a simple question about a family photograph had become an investigation into a sophisticated network of researchers who had been documenting and preserving advanced scientific work throughout the early 1900s. The symbol wasn't just a family tradition. It was a marker used by an entire community of pioneering scientists and inventors. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Portland State University's historian specializing in early Pacific Northwest development, met Margaret and Dr. Rodriguez in her office the following morning. Surrounding them were the glass plate negatives, photographs, and journal entries that had been recovered from the various sites. Dr. Harper's expertise in regional history was crucial for understanding the broader context of what they had discovered. "What you've uncovered," Dr. Harper said, studying the materials carefully, "appears to be evidence of what we might call an underground scientific community. The early 1900s were a time of tremendous innovation, but also significant social and economic barriers for many researchers, particularly those working outside established academic institutions." She pointed to a map of the Pacific Northwest, marking locations where similar symbols had appeared in historical documents. "I've seen references to this symbol in archived materials from Seattle, Vancouver, and San Francisco. At the time, I assumed they were decorative elements or local artistic traditions. But given what you found, I believe we're looking at a coordinated network of researchers who were sharing information and resources across the region." The glass plates, when properly developed and printed, revealed families and individuals from throughout the Pacific Northwest, all incorporating the symbol into their formal portraits. But more than that, the images showed laboratories, workshops, and equipment that represented scientific capabilities far beyond what was commonly available in the early 1900s. Margaret opened Thomas Whitmore's later journal entries, which described regular correspondence and meetings with researchers throughout the region. "We gathered quarterly," one entry read, "sharing discoveries and coordinating our preservation efforts. The work we do individually becomes more powerful when connected with the efforts of our colleagues. The symbol ensures that future researchers will understand the connections between our scattered sites." Dr. Harper's analysis of the historical context revealed why such a network might have been necessary. The early 1900s were dominated by large corporations and established academic institutions. Independent researchers, particularly those working on advanced projects, often faced skepticism or outright hostility. Creating an informal network would have allowed them to share resources and validate each other's work without requiring official recognition. The technical equipment found in the Portland sites was remarkably advanced. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis suggested that the Whitmore family and their associates had developed photographic and optical techniques that wouldn't be widely understood for several decades. "This isn't just ahead of its time," he explained. "It's evidence of parallel development, researchers working independently but reaching conclusions that wouldn't be formally recognized until much later." As they examined more of the recovered materials, patterns emerged. The network had been focused on what they called information preservation, developing techniques to store and transmit complex data using methods that would remain stable for decades or centuries. The photographs themselves were just one aspect of their work. They had also developed chemical preservation techniques, mechanical encoding systems, and what appeared to be early forms of data compression. They weren't just scientists, Margaret realized. They were archivists. They understood that their work might not be appreciated in their own time, so they created an elaborate system to ensure it would be preserved for future generations who would have the knowledge and technology to properly interpret it. The afternoon was spent cataloging and cross-referencing the materials, building a comprehensive picture of the network's scope and activities. By evening, Margaret understood that the Whitmore family portrait was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a sophisticated preservation system that had been operating successfully for over a century, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The weekend brought Margaret to the Oregon Historical Society's main research library, where she hoped to find additional documentation about the families and individuals connected to the symbol network. Armed with names and dates from Thomas Whitmore's journals, she began a systematic search through archived materials, city directories, and newspaper records from the early 1900s. What emerged was a picture of remarkable individuals who had contributed to Portland's early development in ways that hadn't been fully recognized. Thomas Whitmore himself had been a consulting engineer for several major construction projects, including early bridge designs and innovative building techniques. His wife Helen had been one of Portland's first female members of the state's Botanical Society, conducting research on native plant preservation. But the most intriguing discoveries came from cross-referencing the other families whose portraits contained the symbol. Dr. Samuel Chen, no relation to Margaret, had been an early pioneer in Pacific Northwest seismology, developing earthquake monitoring techniques decades before they became standard. The Morrison family had created innovative agricultural techniques that significantly improved crop yields in the region's unique climate conditions. Each family had made significant contributions to their fields, but their work had been documented in ways that ensured it would be preserved independently of official academic or governmental recognition. The symbol network had created a parallel system of knowledge preservation that operated outside conventional institutions. Margaret's research revealed that the preservation protocol was far more sophisticated than she had initially realized. The families hadn't just hidden materials in random locations. They had created a systematic approach that included redundant storage sites, cross-referenced documentation, and multiple methods of information encoding. Thomas Whitmore's final journal entries, dating from 1925, described the completion of what he called Phase 1 of the preservation protocol. "We have successfully established primary and secondary sites throughout the region," he wrote. "The photographic markers are in place, and the documentation has been secured using multiple preservation techniques. Future researchers will find sufficient information to reconstruct our work and understand its significance." But the journal also hinted at additional phases of the project that would continue beyond the original network. References to Eastern colleagues and international coordination suggested that the Pacific Northwest Network was part of a much larger, possibly global system of information preservation. The implications were staggering. Margaret realized she wasn't just investigating a local historical curiosity. She was uncovering evidence of what might be one of the most sophisticated information preservation systems ever created, designed by people who understood that conventional methods of documentation might not survive political, economic, or social upheavals. As she packed her research materials at the end of the day, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility. The Whitmore family and their associates had trusted that someday, someone would understand their work and ensure its proper preservation. After more than a century, that responsibility had fallen to her and her colleagues. The question now was not just what the network had preserved, but how to ensure that this remarkable legacy would be properly documented, studied, and recognized for its true significance. The symbol in the 1910 family portrait had opened a door to understanding, but Margaret suspected they had only begun to explore what lay beyond that threshold. 2 weeks after the discovery of the preservation network, Margaret found herself in the conference room of the Portland Historical Society, surrounded by experts who had been assembled to evaluate and authenticate her findings. Dr. Michael Stevens from the University of Oregon's History Department, Dr. Janet Morrison from the Pacific Northwest Historical Research Center, and Dr. Robert Kim from Portland State's Imaging Science Program all studied the materials with the careful attention that such a significant discovery demanded. "The implications of what you've uncovered," Dr. Stevens said, looking up from Thomas Whitmore's journals, "extend far beyond local history. This appears to be evidence of systematic scientific documentation and preservation that predates similar efforts by decades. The sophistication of their methods suggests knowledge and resources that we haven't properly credited to this time period." Dr. Morrison, who had been examining the technical equipment recovered from the various sites, nodded in agreement. "The preservation techniques they used are remarkably effective. Materials that should have deteriorated significantly show minimal degradation after more than a century. They clearly understood chemistry and materials science at a level that wasn't widely documented until much later. The authentication process had been thorough but conclusive. Carbon dating confirmed the age of the materials. Chemical analysis verified the composition of the photographic elements, and historical cross-referencing established the authenticity of the documented individuals and locations. What had started as Margaret's curiosity about a symbol in an old photograph had become one of the most significant historical discoveries in recent Pacific Northwest research. Dr. Kim's technical analysis had revealed additional layers of information embedded in the various photographs. They weren't just preserving scientific data, he explained. They were creating a comprehensive record of their entire community, family relationships, collaborative projects, resource-sharing networks, and intellectual development over time. It's essentially a complete social and scientific history, encoded and preserved with extraordinary attention to detail. Margaret had spent the morning working with the experts to develop a plan for properly preserving and studying the materials. The network had been designed to survive for centuries, but it now needed modern conservation techniques to ensure its continued preservation. More importantly, the discovery needed to be documented and shared in ways that would honor the original creator's intentions while making the information accessible to contemporary researchers. What strikes me most, Margaret told the assembled experts, is the trust these families placed in future generations. They couldn't know when or how their materials would be discovered, but they designed their preservation system with the faith that someday people would understand the significance of what they had created. The afternoon brought visitors to the Historical Society, descendants of some of the families identified in the network. Eleanor Hartwell had contacted relatives of the other families after Margaret's research had identified them, and several had traveled to Portland to see the materials their ancestors had preserved. James Morrison, great-grandson of the family whose agricultural innovations had been documented in the network, stood quietly as he examined his family's portion of the preserved materials. "We always knew great-grandfather had been involved in some kind of collaborative research," he said, "but the family stories made it sound more like a hobby than serious scientific work. To see this level of documentation and preservation, it changes how we understand our family's contribution to the region's development." As the day ended, Margaret realized that the discovery had created connections that extended far beyond historical documentation. The families who had participated in the network had maintained their collaborative spirit across generations, and their descendants were now working together to ensure that this remarkable legacy would be properly preserved and studied. 3 months after the initial discovery, Margaret stood before an audience of historians, scientists, and community members in Portland State University's auditorium. The formal presentation of her findings marked the culmination of research that had transformed not only her understanding of Pacific Northwest history, but also revealed a remarkable story of innovation, collaboration, and foresight that had operated in secret for over a century. The symbol that appeared in the 1910 Whitmore family portrait, Margaret began, displaying the now famous image on the auditorium's large screen, was far more than a decorative element or family tradition. It was a marker, a key that identified members of a sophisticated network of researchers who were conducting advanced scientific work throughout the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. The presentation covered all aspects of the discovery, from the initial observation of the symbol through the systematic recovery of materials from multiple sites. Dr. Rodriguez presented the technical analysis of the photographic preservation techniques, while Dr. Harper provided historical context for the social and economic factors that had made such a network necessary. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret revealed the network's ultimate purpose. These families and individuals weren't just preserving their own work, she explained. They were creating a comprehensive archive of human innovation and collaboration that was designed to survive regardless of changing political, economic, or social conditions. They understood that knowledge itself is fragile, and they created a system to protect and preserve it for future generations. The symbol, they had learned, incorporated multiple levels of meaning. At its most basic level, it identified members of the network and marked materials that contained preserved information. But deeper analysis had revealed geometric and mathematical relationships within the symbol itself, a kind of visual equation that encoded fundamental principles about information preservation and collaborative research. Dr. Kim's continued analysis of the embedded photographic data had revealed additional sites throughout the western United States and Canada. The Pacific Northwest Network had been part of a continental system of information preservation that extended from Mexico to Alaska. Each regional network had used variations of the same basic symbol, creating a continent-spanning archive of early 20th century innovation and research. What makes this discovery particularly significant, Margaret continued, is not just the advanced techniques they developed, but the collaborative spirit that made it all possible. These families and individuals understood that knowledge grows stronger when it's shared, and they created a system that ensured their collective work would survive and benefit future generations. The presentation concluded with the announcement of the Pacific Northwest Innovation Archive, a collaborative project between multiple universities and historical societies to properly study, preserve, and share the materials that had been recovered. Descendants of the original network families would serve as advisors, ensuring that the archive would honor their ancestors' intentions while making the information accessible to contemporary researchers. As the audience applauded, Margaret looked out at the faces in the auditorium. Historians, scientists, community members, and descendants of the families whose foresight had made this discovery possible. The symbol in a simple family portrait, had revealed a story of remarkable people who had trusted that someday someone would understand the significance of what they had preserved. The 1910 Whitmore family portrait now hung in a place of honor at the Portland Historical Society, but it was no longer just a family photograph. It had become a symbol itself, a testament to the power of human curiosity, collaboration, and the enduring belief that knowledge shared across generations can illuminate the present and inspire the future. The symbol's meaning had finally been revealed, not as a single answer, but as an opening to understanding the remarkable legacy of people who had looked beyond their own time to ensure that their contributions to human knowledge would survive and flourish for generations to come.